The US-Israeli war with Iran has had a devastating humanitarian impact that could last for years. The bombing of energy infrastructure, fuel depots and oil tankers has not only shocked the global economy, but polluted air, soil and waterways with toxic chemicals. So what will be the true toll of this war on populations and ecosystems around the globe? To discuss this, I'm joined by Narges Bajoghli, Professor of Middle East Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, and author of How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare. It's a pleasure to have you on UpFront. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we've seen the humanitarian toll of this war from day one, when an airstrike on an elementary school killed 160 children. But we are also seeing another type of suffering unfold, apocalyptic images of clouds of smoke, black rain. This is after Israel hit Iran's oil depots. Iran has called these attacks ecocide, while the World Health Organization is warning of severe health impacts. Can you lay out the health risks of the sustained bombing campaign?
Sure. So that bombing campaign of oil depots that surrounds Tehran, and Tehran is a city surrounded by mountains, so the air is hard to move, means that toxins have been released into the air and have gone into soil, waterways, foodways, and more importantly, into lungs of everyday residents of the city of 9 million people. The type of toxins that have been released are lodging themselves into lungs, and what doctors and toxicologists inside of Iran are telling me is that what they are afraid of is that these will have impacts for years and potentially generations to come.
Now, in response to these escalating attacks and widening threats from Israel and the US, Iran has threatened to bomb the desalination plants in the Gulf. Millions of people rely on this crucial water infrastructure in that region. How disastrous would this be?
It would be extremely disastrous. And this is part of what makes this war so incredibly dangerous in the way that it is being fought. With Israel and the United States targeting civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and Iran promising to respond in kind, what is happening here is that this is not a war between governments. It is a war that is being played out, and the brunt of it is being experienced by civilians on the ground.
The long-term health impacts of living in war zones has been well documented over many years, from rising cancers in Iraq after 2 US-led wars there, and also birth defects in Vietnam. I'm just curious to know, is there any provision in international law that holds militaries and governments accountable for this type of fallout, the health consequences and the environmental impact?
Yes, especially for toxic warfare, we have the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which is supposed to ban any kind of chemical warfare being used. We then have the Chemical Weapons Convention that took place in the 1990s, specifically to ban the further use of chemicals, which were used in mass in the Iran-Iraq war by the Iraqis in that war. But what you see when you look closely at these wars that have played out across the globe, but especially in the Middle East in the past 4 to 5 decades, is that because there's a lot of money to be made in warfare, and because lawyers and others really mess with the ways in which these bombs are classified, you have instances where, just as you mentioned, depleted uranium in Iraq has been used to such an extent where there is much higher instances of cancer in places like Iraq than you have in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So as long as there is profit to be made from war making, and as long as our modern type of warfare is so toxic in nature, unfortunately, this is going to continue.
In a recent piece for New York Magazine, you wrote, and I quote, "Modern warfare is a chemical event. Every missile, every bomb, every burning fuel depot releases its payload of toxic compounds into the air people breathe. The difference is whether we choose to count it." Tell me a little bit more about what you mean, but I'm also curious to know, is it possible, how difficult is it to account and even quantify the entirety of the impact of modern warfare?
The type of modern warfare that we have today, even so-called conventional bombs, are coated in a lot of chemicals so that upon impact on civilian infrastructure, on homes, in any place where you have a lot of civilians there, it releases so many toxins that it becomes a form of chemical warfare. The fact of the reality is that the more that these kinds of weapons are used, and the fact that warfare just is, relentless bombing one after the other, it becomes increasingly difficult for doctors and scientists, toxicologists in particular, to be able to have the resources and the time, because this kind of research takes a lot of time, to have the resources and the time to actually be able to quantify and to understand how this kind of toxins are being used and what kinds of impacts they're having on humans, but also importantly on the environment, which then means that it's going to have multi-generational impacts.
So you've also written about the consequences of sanctions on Iranian society and the economy, and we often focus on the economy and seldom on the health system. How do you assess the way decades of Western sanctions have impacted the health system? And I wonder what this kind of pressure means for Iran's ability to recover when the war ends.
So sanctions, economic sanctions, the extent to which they've been used against a country like Iran, we must understand it as a form of economic warfare. And oftentimes sanctions, though they are meant to impact the state, really what they do is they impact the population far more. And they impact civilian infrastructure in similar ways that we're seeing in hot warfare today. That includes hospitals, that includes any kind of health facility. So over time, the more that sanctions are on the books, the more that it begins to erode at the medical infrastructure of countries. What you see is that things become, pharmaceuticals, treatments for very complex cancers, even for a lot of the survivors of chemical warfare from the 1980s, once the sanctions became hardened on Iran, had a very hard time getting access to the inhalers they needed to continue to breathe, for example. So to have economic sanctions be on the books for so long on a country like Iran, and before that on a country like Iraq, then to be followed by bombing campaigns, means that you are adding one layer of warfare on top of another in order to collapse civilian infrastructure and to collapse the state's ability to respond to the humanitarian needs on the ground.
So beyond the regional effects of bombing energy infrastructure, oil tankers destroying cities, this war could accelerate climate change. A recent analysis of the climate cost of this war found that 5 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions were released within 2 weeks. Now, over a year, this would be roughly equivalent to the combined emissions of 84 countries. When you think about this war, combined with other conflicts we've seen around the world, Lebanon and Ukraine, not forgetting the devastating genocide in Gaza, what is at stake here for our collective future?
Once you start to sit down and think all of this through, it is quite terrifying. I mean, the amount of bombing that Gaza sustained is equivalent to multiple atomic bombs. The tonnage of it, for example, that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The types of gases that this is releasing into our environment is having real impacts on climate change. Taken, as you said, all of these wars together, from Gaza to Ukraine to now Iran, Lebanon. What we are, we were worried about the question of climate change a few years ago as being something that we had to really deal with within the next decade or so. Now, with all of these really heavy wars that are happening, that timeline only gets sped up. And it is something that we need to take extremely seriously. I mean, and part of what's difficult here is we're worried about the impact of, on a day-to-day basis, of what these bombs are doing to civilian populations on the ground. We're worried about the toxic offloads of these on those civilian populations. But then, as all of these wars are showing us, nothing in warfare stays within the boundaries of a nation state. These things always travel, and we all breathe that air in. We are all living under the consequences of what these toxins are releasing and the impact on the carbon footprint around the world.
Well, Professor Narges Bajoghli, thank you very much for sharing such crucial information with us here on UpFront. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.